You know that old saying, you are what you eat? Well, what if it's more than just a saying? What if every single meal you have is a choice? A choice that could literally add or subtract time from your life. I mean, that's a huge question, right? And today, we're actually going to dive into the science that gives us some real answers. We're going to unpack a massive study that points to the exact foods that might just help you live longer. And when I say this research is massive, I am not kidding. This isn't some small little study. Nope. The data we're about to look at comes from a review of studies that included, get this, over 1 million people. A million. So, just to be super clear, this isn't one single study. Researchers pulled together the results from 41 major studies on food and how long we live. It's basically one of the most complete pictures we've ever gotten on this topic, and it was published in the journal Advances in Nutrition. Okay, so the goal here was to sift through this mountain of data to find the real patterns, the stuff that shows up again and again. They were asking a pretty simple question, really. What are the longest living people eating? And maybe just as important, what are they not eating? All right, let's kick things off with the good news, the foods that the science points to as giving us a real leg up in the longevity game. Look, we all know a healthy diet can be complicated, right? But what's so cool about this review is that it found 2 food groups, more than any others, that had the absolute strongest, most consistent link to a longer life. Just 2. So, you ready? The top 2 longevity all-stars are nuts and whole grains. That's it. They have the strongest connection to living a longer life. But hey, the list doesn't end there. Fruits, vegetables, fish, legumes, and yep, even white meat all consistently showed up as lowering the risk of dying from anything. Okay, but here's a super interesting little detail they found. When we're talking about fruits and veggies, more isn't always better. Check this out. The benefit really jumps when you go from eating just some to an optimal amount. But once you get past that optimal point, pushing into excessive amounts, it doesn't really seem to add much more protection. It's like there's a sweet spot. Okay, so that's the good stuff. But of course, the research didn't just look at what we should be adding to our plates. It also zeroed in on the foods that were consistently linked with a higher risk of, not living as long. And you know what? The evidence on this side of things was just as clear-cut. Eating more processed and even unprocessed red meat, along with sugary drinks, was consistently tied to a higher risk of an earlier death. No ambiguity there. But this is where it gets a little more complicated, because not every food fits neatly into a good or bad category. For some of the most common things we eat every day, the science is still kind of in a gray zone. And I'll bet this is the question you're asking right now, isn't it? Okay, but what about dairy? What about bread? What about eggs? The staples. Where do they fit into all this? And honestly, I love this part because it really shows you how science works. The researchers were totally upfront about it. For dairy and refined grains, we're talking things like white bread and pasta, the data from all these studies was inconclusive. Plain and simple. There just wasn't a strong enough signal pointing one way or the other. It was pretty much the same story for eggs and added sugars. Now, the data did show a little bit of a trend towards a higher risk, but it wasn't statistically significant. So what does that mean in plain English? It means that while there might be a connection, it just wasn't strong enough in this giant analysis to say for sure. This is definitely an area where we just need more research. Okay, so we've covered the what, but now for the really fascinating part, the why. Why do some foods seem to protect us while others seem to do harm? To get that, we've got to zoom in and look at what's happening inside our bodies right down at the cellular level. So it really boils down to 2 key things: oxidative stress and chronic inflammation. The easiest way to picture them? Think of oxidative stress as a kind of slow internal rusting process. And think of chronic inflammation as a constant low-level fire simmering inside your body. Over the years, that damage really adds up and can lead to major chronic diseases. So let's walk through the bad guy pathway, step by step. You eat foods that are high in things like saturated fats and refined sugars. Step 2, that triggers that internal resting and fire we just talked about, the inflammation and oxidative stress. Step 3, over time, that constant stress helps create chronic diseases. And step 4, that ultimately leads to a higher risk of mortality. See the chain reaction? Now, on the flip side, those longevity all-stars do the complete opposite. They are packed with things like antioxidants, fiber, and healthy fats. Think of these nutrients as your body's own internal repair crew. They show up and actively fight that inflammation, they clean up the damage from that rusting, and they just help all your systems run the way they're supposed to.
Okay, so that was a pretty deep dive into the science, right? Let's zoom back out now and really lock in the key takeaways, the stuff you can actually use.
So if you only remember one thing from all this, make it this. At the very top, with the strongest positive impact, nuts and whole grains. Right behind them, also fantastic, fruits, veggies, and fish. On the negative side, with a clear link to higher risk, red meat and sugary drinks. And in that inconclusive zone where we need more info, dairy and refined grains. The jury's still out on those.
Now, it's really important to remember something here. This is a big picture, bird's eye view. This review looked at broad food groups, not the nitty-gritty details. So for example, baked fish is obviously very different from deep-fried fish, right? The context of how you cook and what you eat it with, that stuff always matters. And that really is the next big question for researchers. We've got a pretty good map of what to eat, but the next set of questions is all about the how. How does the way we cook our food change things? How does combining certain foods affect the outcome? That's the next step.
Look, science is always a journey. It's never going to be done. But every single study like this one gives us a little more power. It gives us the power to make a slightly better choice at our very next meal. So the real question isn't what science is going to figure out tomorrow. The real question is, what are you going to put on your plate today?